Takes a few seconds. Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks. So I'd like to welcome you all to this book discussion event in the form of an international webinar. And good morning for Lucia, Mike, Daniel. For Daniel, it's really early morning. Good afternoon for those who are participating from India. And it must be early evening in Manila if someone is here from the Philippines. So our book, the book that I co-edited with Mike, Mike is here, Michael Kho Lim. He has recently joined University of Glasgow, UK. So the book Sine, Lav Diaz, a long take on the Filipino Auteur, published by Intellect, distributed in the US by the University of Chicago Press, and in Asia by De La Salle University Publishing House. The book germinated, the thought of the book, the idea about the book germinated long back in Melbourne when we were watching Lav Diaz films in Melbourne International Film Festival, because the theatre going experience is absolutely necessary in the context of Lav Diaz. So Mike and I started collaborating on this, and 2 years later, Intellect accepted our proposal. It took us 2 more years to come up with the book, and we'd like to thank all the contributors. This year, in August, we had a formal book release event at the Cinemalaya Philippine Independent Film Festival. It was hosted by the Cultural Center of the Philippines. And this is the first, so that was the festival release. It was covered widely by the Filipino news media. And this is the first academic book discussion event on Sine, Lav Diaz, which is the first book-length work on Lav Diaz. Even though Michael Kho, one of our contributors, he has also published a book, but that is a collection of interviews, and this is a collection of writings and one interview with Lav. So I would like to thank our moderator, Professor Lucia Nagib, and our speakers, Dr. Daniel Fairfax and Dr. Kaushik Bhaumik. So I'll start with a brief introduction, and then I'll hand it over to Lucia, who is the moderator. So Lucia Nagib, of course, doesn't need an introduction, but, well, it's the custom. So Lucia is professor in film, Department of Film, Theatre and Television at the University of Reading, and also the founder and rotating director of the Center for Film Aesthetics and Cultures. As you know, Lucia's research interests lie in Brazilian cinema and also in the field of world cinema, the idea of realism, theories, histories, and geographies of world cinema. Lucia has published widely, apart from editing special journal issues like that Aniki journal issue, the Portuguese-English bilingual journal, and she edited a special issue in Brazilian cinema. Some of her recent works include Realist Cinema as World Cinema, Non-Cinema, Intermedial Passages, Total Cinema, published by Amsterdam University Press last year. Then World Cinema and the Ethics of Realism, published by Bloomsbury in 2011. Lucia has completed an AHRC and FAPESP, AHRC Arts and Humanities Research Council of the UK, and FAPESP is a Sao Paulo-based Brazilian funding agency. So they jointly founded Lucia's project titled Intermedial History of Brazilian Cinema, exploring intermediality as a historiographic method. And as one of the deliverables of that project, Lucia co-directed a film with Samuel Paiva. It's titled Passages. It's on Vimeo. University of St. Andrews organized a screening of it last year. I had the chance of watching it. So that's it for the time being. Thank you. And if you're interested in Lucia's work, those of you who haven't read it, I think you can access Lucia's latest work on AUP, Amsterdam University Press website. It's open access. Thank you. Off to Lucia.
Thank you so much, Parichay, for this lavish and undeserved introduction. Thanks very much. Let me start by saying how pleased I am to be able to meet all these scholars, including you, Parichay, who I greatly admire from a distance, but hardly ever have the chance to meet in person. I suppose that one of the very few bonuses that we have drawn from the pandemic was the discovery of how much we can connect online. My only hope is that this connection is not dissolved once we can travel and socialize again more freely, and instead is strengthened and developed further. I'm also pleased and humbled to have been deemed qualified to be included in a debate about Lav Diaz and on a book, a fantastic book about him. Many thanks to Parichay for his very kind invitation. Even though I am a great fan of Lav Diaz and his films, I'm far from being an expert. I'm actually ashamed of the huge amount of catching up I still need to do in terms of watching his famously long films. However, in preparation for this discussion, I did revisit some of his work, including the extraordinary Norte, The End of History, which impressed me yet again, like all his other films, for its ability to capture and impart the drama of existence. Each frame and each scene contain the same interrogation, the same perplexity with the absurdity of life, the tragedy of being in this world, but also the inscrutable beauty of life. Reading the book on Lav Diaz, Sine, Lav Diaz, or The Cinema of Lav Diaz, edited by Parichay Patra and Michael Lim, was yet another fascinating experience for me. I felt like reading a novel, each chapter making me look forward to the next one. The book impressed me, first of all, for its strong lineup of contributors, including my friend May Adado Inga Wanaji, who is the one who first introduced me to the work of this extraordinary filmmaker. But the list of contributors impresses also for its multinational diversity, demonstrating how much the work of Diaz has touched hearts and minds around the world. Despite the difficulties of appreciating his work, which is fortunately now becoming increasingly available online. Length is always cited as the major stumbling block into Diaz's universe. However, this should in principle not, turning the page, sorry, not be a problem, given how long the series available on streaming platforms can be. We have a series that lasts for whole years. However, I learned reading this book that Diaz is very particular about the integrity of his work and requires it to be screened in its full length in the majority of the cases. There is in the book an enlightening final chapter that deals precisely with the particular mode of distribution, exhibition, and reception required for Diaz films. The book impresses, moreover, for its openness to the challenges presented by Diaz films, which have given origin to some heated controversies. Diaz's work has even been accused of artlessness by film critic Adrian Martin, who I think is here attending this event. Here represented by a revised version of his damning critique of Norte, previously published in Sight and Sound, and now revised for this publication. With its confrontational and fearless style, this book has taught me huge amounts on the history of Filipino cinema, on Diaz's own vision of the political history of the Philippines, his appropriation of Dostoevsky, the religious allegories in his films, his artistic heritage, his working in and disappointments with the film industry, and his staunch independence as a filmmaker. Not being a specialist, far from that, as I said, it's now time to hand over to those with real authority. And I think that Parichay has already explained the format of this event today. So the first speaker will have 20 minutes to present his vision, and I will then ask a few questions in 5 minutes, and then we will move on to the next speaker and finish the event with a general discussion, including Q&A with the audience. And I think altogether the event will take about 2 hours. So we start with the first speaker, Daniel Fairfax, who is an assistant professor in film studies at the Goethe-Universität, Frankfurt, having completed his PhD in film studies and comparative literature at Yale University in 2017. His research focuses on French film theory in the post-1968 period. And for Amsterdam University Press, he has been responsible for editing and translating Cinema Against Spectacle, Technique and Ideology by Jean-Louis Comolli, Conversations with Christian Metz, selected interviews on film theory, and The Structures of the Film Experience by Jean-Pierre Meunier, Historical Assessments and Phenomenological Expansions. His 2-volume monograph, The Red Years of Cahiers du Cinéma. Oh, I'm looking forward to deeping into this fantastic monograph, has been published by AUP in 2021. Daniel is also an editor of and regular contributor to the Australian online film journal, Senses of Cinema. Thanks, Daniel, for being here today. I look forward to listening to your intervention.
Okay, thanks, Lucia, for that very pleasant introduction. You can hear me all fine? Yes, okay. And but a very big thanks also to Parichay and Michael for bringing this book together. It's a project I'm really proud to see has materialized. I enjoyed immensely reading it and rereading it. I think it's a real pleasure, which is not something I would always say about kind of contemporary film scholarship, let's say. This book is exceptional in that regard. It was also a project I had hoped to be a part of, but unfortunately, due to some personal reasons, could not contribute a text to. So I'm very happy to be able to kind of contribute to the book in its expanded sense, let's say, the echoes of the book in the means of this meeting. And I'm very happy to see so many people in attendance. I think what I would like to signal in this presentation, and I would have to say, Lucia, I also wouldn't consider myself an authority on Lav Diaz. Far from it. Definitely well versed in some of his films, but there are gaps in my knowledge of his oeuvre as well, particularly when it comes to the early works. But what I really appreciated upon reading this book, and I really want to conceive of this presentation as a kind of a response to the book, let's say, a kind of, let's say, expression of some of the thoughts and ideas I had while reading the book, and in the wake of reading the book. But what I really appreciated first and foremost about it was precisely the kind of genuinely cinephilic passion that came through from all of the writers, I think, in the book. And again, that's something I wouldn't necessarily say about all projects surfacing in recent years, but in this book, it really comes through. In that sense, I like, Lucia, your comparison of the book to a novel. But for me, the thing I think I most thought about, or that it most evoked in me, was a kind of earlier period of, let's say, film publishing that goes back more to probably the 60s and 70s, when you get books about film being published, but that are not kind of entrenched in this kind of academic institutional apparatus, but come more from a much more diverse or heterogeneous sources that come out of film criticism or come out of pure kind of cinephilia. In that sense, while this book, it has a mix of critics, of scholars, and all of whom are aficionados of Lav Diaz's work. I think what I really appreciated is precisely that it still has that kind of just enthusiasm for the subject matter. And that's something I wanted to highlight, first of all. Of course, I guess what's helped about that, and maybe what also led to that evocation in my mind is precisely, as I think Parichay also already mentioned, that it's the first book on Lav Diaz, which can be a bit of a surprise when it's kind of put in those terms. I mean, first monograph, or not monograph per se, but certainly first bona fide book on dedicated entirely to Diaz's work by other kind of scholars and critics, which is kind of surprising given that he has been a prominent figure on the world cinema stage, let's say, for a number of years now. I mean, he's far from being a young filmmaker or a new filmmaker. So in one sense, it's a shame that it's taken till now and taken till the initiative of Parichay and Michael to break that duck, to use a cricketing metaphor. But the advantage of that is that there's not yet a kind of an established hermeneutic apparatus applied to Lav Diaz's films that kind of the book has to somehow enter into. And that, in that sense, I think there's a great freedom in the writing that I felt come through in the book. With this freedom also comes, I think, certainly something of an aleatory quality in the book. It positions itself between criticism and scholarship. It kind of, comes from both backgrounds, which I found invigorating. In that sense, my presentation will follow in the spirit of that book. I will also be a little bit aleatory and kind of like offer a few kind of, somewhat disconnected remarks. But also, in a sense, the book follows in the spirit of Lav Diaz himself. His filmmaking also has that, certain kind of rough-hewn quality to it sometimes, or a certain, certain aleatory quality also in its narrative structures. So I think it's perfectly appropriate, and one of the great attributes of the book, in my view. Yes, I think though, to the extent that there is a kind of ready-made critical, let's say, approach that one can take to Lav Diaz's films, that is kind of like the first go-to for critics or scholars who are kind of attempting to respond to his films. Parichay and Michael, in their introduction, locate this very clearly in two, let's say, critical tools or critical frameworks that tend to predominate in the reception of Lav Diaz's films. Namely, firstly, of course, the national context, so his status as a Filipino filmmaker, and how he can be understood within the context of the Philippines as a nation, its history, its politics, its culture, on the one hand, and then more specifically, Filipino cinema, its own filmmaking tradition, both in the kind of commercial sense, so the film industry in Philippines, which has had up and downs, but it has been, in certain periods, commercially a thriving industry. So there's, that's one context, the national cinema context, Lav Diaz as Filipino filmmaker. And then the other context is his putative membership in the international or even global movement of slow cinema or contemplative cinema that has really emerged in the 21st century, in particular in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. And those are, when it comes to critical responses to Lav Diaz, those are really the two dominant frameworks that are used to analyze his films. And I think on one level, they're undeniably very important for understanding Lav Diaz, for understanding the context he makes his films, for understanding the kind of also the aesthetic context in which he's making his films, so the context of contemporary world cinema, and the certain aesthetic trends and movements that are arising in that international context. But on another level, I think Parichay and Michael are very correct to point out the limitations that those frameworks can give rise to. And in a sense, they can lead to a certain reductionist approach to Lav Diaz, which I think it's very important to take at least some distance from in order to avoid those kind of pitfalls. We don't want to just assign Lav Diaz as yet another member in this kind of canonical cohort of slow cinema filmmakers in contemporary world cinema, or as kind of another Filipino filmmaker in the vein of Broca and so on and so forth. That would be, I think, doing an injustice to his work, which has a great deal of specificity to it, has a kind of unique quality to it that is really, I think in a sense, if we want to retain the kind of let's say an auteurist framework to his cinema, I don't think that should necessarily be junked. That is his, this kind of specificity is in a sense his auteurist signature. In that sense, and that I want to probe later in my presentation. In that sense, I think the editors and also many of the writers in the volume reject or certainly view with a certain degree of suspicion the fanboyish cult that has emerged around Lav Diaz, and the figure of the fanboy is a little bit kind of like the kind of whipping boy of this book in a sense. So this idea that he's this kind of almost demiurgic figure who can do no wrong, who has like every film of his is this kind of unqualified masterpiece, and every moment of each film is an example of kind of cinematic splendor that we should just kind of bow down to in awe at his genius. And again, I think it's important that we don't do that we don't kind of just give praise to him, but that also we kind of adopt a critical lens. And I think that this book does that very well. Again, I kind of see a certain echo of many of the, let's say, debates of earlier decades, 1950s, 1960s, particularly around the question precisely of auteurism and the auteur. Most specifically in the French context and kind of Parisian cinephilia, the emergence, of particularly the kind of young Turk critics of Cahiers de Cinema and certain other journals, who often kind of adopted an extreme variant of auteurism that perhaps other figures considered it worthwhile criticizing to a certain degree. So again, it's the idea that the auteur can do no wrong. Every film of an auteur is a masterpiece. This is something that, you can still retain an auteurist framework without necessarily ascribing to that extreme version of the theory. There is though a conundrum, I think, that presents itself to the editors and to the contributors to the book, namely that because it is the first book on Lav Diaz, the first kind of real scholarly take on Lav Diaz in book form. You don't want to be too critical either. Otherwise you're kind of demolishing the raison d'etre for your own project. Well, why write a book about this guy anyway? And I'm not saying you guys do that at all, but far from it. I think the book very much does establish, argue for, and defend the importance of Lav Diaz's work as really one of the most interesting and most in some sense, vital filmmakers of the present day, of the contemporary era. As I said, I think this kind of, the kind of rejecting a kind of uncritical adulation of Lav Diaz would hazard not in any way be looked upon unkindly by Lav Diaz himself. I think it's actually part of his approach to the production process, and indeed his kind of concept of film style that precisely invites, as I mentioned, a kind of rough-hewn quality to his films, and one where he does actually very consciously, let's say, skirt the threshold between this kind of, let's say, between aesthetic success and aesthetic failure, perhaps. This is his kind of renowned artlessness, a term that kind of appeared a few times in the volume. But I think this kind of artless aesthetics is something that's willed for by Lav Diaz. I don't think this is the result of a filmmaker who just doesn't know what he's doing, or he's kind of like lazy or hopeless or whatever. I think this is a very conscious aesthetic strategy of a filmmaker working within this kind of defined parameters. And again, I think the interview that Lav Diaz that is included in the book with Lav Diaz shows how kind of hyper-conscious he is, possibly due to his own circumstances, more so than many other filmmakers, of the logistical parameters in which he's working. So the role of, the financing of his films, the technology of his films, and then the distribution and the kind of reception of his films. This is a filmmaker who's aware of all of those factors and is trying to kind of productively work within those factors and kind of push buttons where they need to be pushed. So I think Lav Diaz's work is exciting precisely because it kind of it permanently runs the danger of kind of, in some sense, missteps or of kind of just not working, not coming off. In a sense, I mean, it's always a gamble to work in this kind of long form. So the kind of, these extended durations, is it worth the spectator's investment of, 4, 5, 7 hours? And indeed, Lav Diaz is kind of asking us to take that gamble with his films. This is something you kind of have to go into with that sense of unpredictability, let's say. And I think that's essential to Lav Diaz's cinema. I like the fact that the editors kind of use the long take, which is, one of the hallmarks of Lav Diaz's films, almost as their own critical device, which I found quite interesting. And I kind of had that, I got that also from reading the book. So, Lav Diaz's films as long takes, but also a long take on his films, I found quite stimulating. I would say though that the book's conundrum about how critical should you be about this filmmaker who you also want to kind of help establish the legitimacy of, certainly in a kind of scholarly framework. It's probably exemplified, I think Lucia already brought it up, by Adrian Martin's contribution to the text, building on a review he wrote for Sight and Sound of Norte in 2015. And that precisely poses the question, both the original text and this kind of updated form, of how much do we dare to, or how much are we willing to criticize a filmmaker like Lav Diaz? With regards to Adrian's contribution, I probably disagree a little bit on the specificities of his criticisms of Norte. I mean, I find personally Norte to be his most accomplished film, and the one where I least have the sense of, what's working, what's not working. I mean, that film seems to me to work, let's say. But I agree on this broader issue, and I think criticism, I think in some sense, this is a book that's not just about cinema, but it's also about criticism itself, or our response to films itself. And I think criticism needs to have the possibility of being critical. I think that's kind of an absolute necessity for criticism, for film criticism, to stay alive as a means of communication, and then for cinema to stay alive as a form that's evolving, that's not just that doesn't ossify and then kind of like cohere into this kind of fossilized form. And that criticism also needs to have a kind of sensitivity to it. It needs to be nimble. It needs precisely to be, let's say, particularly, I think, focused on these kind of stylistic questions or questions of form that avoid it from kind of just conforming to preconceived notions of kind of what makes a good film, or what makes a palatable film and what doesn't. That danger there is kind of scholasticism, and I think I don't think anyone could accuse Adrian Martin of that, or should accuse Adrian Martin of that. Perhaps he was accused of that. I think that this danger is possibly all the more so for film scholarship, that is, film studies in a kind of academic setting, which seems particularly allergic to uttering kind of critical kind of pronouncements on films, but certainly in terms of kind of stylistic questions, perhaps less so when it comes to kind of overt content, politics, and so on and so forth. But I think it's important also to really hammer home that we can defend Lav Diaz as an artist while still expressing particular misgivings about moments in his films or elements of his films. And I don't think the two are in contradiction to each other. I think that's precisely part of the development of any artist, of any filmmaker, that they go through that kind of a process in tandem with those who are critically responding to their films. I think one thing to note about Adrian Martin's text is I think it echoes a 2010 editorial by Nick James on the Turkish film Honey, which James kind of pointed out as a kind of danger, as an example of slow cinema kind of actually potentially becoming formulaic and just kind of there being nothing to these films apart from their kind of slowness. That also raised a huge debate in kind of film criticism, which I think Adrian Martin's text is kind of echoing. And in some sense, I would agree with Nick James that there needs to, in terms of thinking about these films as slow films, there needs to be more to them than just slowness and just emptiness and just minimalism. But I think that is the case with Lav Diaz. And indeed, I think possibly we should refrain from using the word slow necessarily. I think these films are undeniably long, but I wouldn't necessarily categorize them as slow cinema in the same way I would say Where's Ethical or Saming Liang. What are we, 2 minutes to go? Okay, I'll wrap up. In that sense, I think they're much closer to kind of a novelistic structure than, say, other adherents of slow cinema. They're not minimalist works in that sense. There's maybe more I could say about narrative structures in kind of contemporary culture, but I'll refrain from that. But what I did want to bring up is, I mean, what I found interesting was this kind of recurrent figure of Dostoevsky in Lav Diaz's films, and then in the contributions to the book, which I found fascinating on many levels. I think in some sense we could postulate a kind of, and beyond Lav Diaz's own films, we could postulate a kind of something like a global Dostoevsky that goes beyond just a kind of 19th century Russian context, but that stretches out to other cultures, other nations. That kind of, somehow his works speak to artists and populations beyond that context. It's interesting to note that, in my view, at least, the only good Dostoevsky adaptations in cinema are ones that are not straight kind of period films, but that rework his kind of narratives for a contemporary and usually often very culturally different context. So things like obviously Bresson with Pickpocket and A Gentlewoman, Kurosawa with The Idiot. Interestingly, at the same time as Norte came out, Omibayev, a Kazakh filmmaker, also kind of reworked Crime and Punishment as The Student. I think those two films talk to each other quite well. The other thing, though, my very final point is that the figure of Dostoevsky kind of evokes, for me, in relation to Lav Diaz, is the way, this particularly comes through in The Possessed, which, as far as I'm aware, Lav Diaz has not adapted yet, but perhaps, it's a project that's in the way. It almost seems fated to be like a future Lav Diaz film. But the way that Dostoevsky as a novelist, and particularly in that novel, is both a kind of like a post-communist author, in the sense that this is, the Possessed is, and this is the third term, I would think, that comes through in the book, is Lav Diaz's relationship to communism and the whole kind of history of this kind of communist experiment, let's say. And Dostoevsky, The Possessed is this kind of settling of scores with this revolutionary militant movement that he then kind of renounced, but in some ways also a prefiguration of the history of Russia in the 20th century and the Bolsheviks and their emergence and their coming to power and so on and so forth. And I think the same could be said about Lav Diaz in a Filipino context. It is both a kind of post-communist, he is both a kind of post-communist filmmaker emerging after the kind of famous end of history, after this kind of, the Philippines as this kind of Cold War fault line, this kind of arena of revolutionary struggle and civil war and class conflict and so on and so forth, seems to have kind of like dissipated. But in some sense, and I got this particularly from Tom Paulus's evocation of kind of Hölderlin and Novalis and other kind of romantic poets and their relationship to Lav Diaz. He's a proto-communist filmmaker. He's kind of evoking the communism of the future that hopefully kind of, in some sense, learns its lessons from the disasters of the 20th century. And I have one more point, but I think I'll leave that for the discussion because it's a bit of a non sequitur. So I want to end on that note.
Thank you so very much. I think I have 5 minutes for comments and then for the introduction of the next speaker. Perhaps I could just, so many interesting issues that you have raised, each of which I think would lead us to a great new discussion. And one particular question I would have for you is the question of authorship, which is so central and is central to the book, because the book is about one single filmmaker as the great auteur of his films. I wonder whether this is led by the fact that Diaz, like the old Cahiers du Cinéma critics, who then became filmmakers themselves, the ability to talk about their films or even their future films so eloquently, to be the first critics of their films, and in so doing, leading everyone to refer to the person behind the film, like the French New Wave directors were. I mean, by introducing their principles regarding filmmaking, then they would call the attention directly to themselves and be the authors behind it. And obviously there is a whole team who has been working with Lav Diaz from the beginning, and they are a little bit effaced by this major figure and his ability of decision making in terms of how he shoots his films, and also the fact that he's a he. And so there is that thing of male authority to it, which I think comes to the fore. So I don't know if you can join this discussion in 3 minutes now, or you would prefer to leave that to those other structural kind of issues that you wanted to discuss. I think the issue of Dostoevsky that you launched at the end, the question of the long take being or not being what defines slow cinema. So all those things, I think, will come back to the discussion at the end. But I think this question of authorship and the very soul of this book, Lav Diaz, the cinema of Lav Diaz, so it's this sense of property, of possession, of a style, is so pronounced that I think is a question that perhaps I should give you 2-3 minutes now.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's a very important question that I think applies not just to Lav Diaz, very obviously, that it's kind of, I think, a question we raise with all filmmakers, and particularly, I think that there's something I would call like an auteurist aporia, let's say, which is that on the one hand, certainly kind of contemporary scholarship kind of has this kind of skepticism towards the figure of the auteur. Right, ever since Roland Barthes, Death of the Author, and so on and so forth. Well, we know that the author is not this kind of like, as I said, kind of demiurgic figure who kind of like creates an entire universe like just from their sheer will without the kind of contribution of anyone else. Particularly in cinema, that's obviously it's by its nature this kind of collective medium, collective production process. You can't. You require the contributions of kind of so many other people in order for the film to even exist. So in the one sense, there's this kind of theoretical rejection of the auteur and auteurism, but on the other sense, it's still so present and undeniably present. And even the kind of the same people who say, oh, it's like, I don't agree with auteur theory or whatever, still, I'm writing a monograph on Bellatar or something. It's like, well, there's the aporia. Like we kill the auteur, but we still require them to be alive in order to like functionally interpret these films. And in some sense, the auteur is more alive than ever. I mean, you go to a film festival, you don't say I'm watching Norte, you say I'm watching the Lav Diaz, right? Like it's just the Lav Diaz, the Wirras Ethical, whoever. So I think this is the kind of, I think, one of the big like contradictions in film studies. And then in terms of, I think Lav Diaz is very aware of this contradiction, and very aware also of the need for the erection of this auteur figure in order to make his films. That they wouldn't exist. They couldn't be realized unless he established a certain mystique of this is Lav Diaz, and this is like the unique figure, unique mind of Lav Diaz, and so on and so forth. Sorry, Lucia.
I think we have to wrap up here for the moment, and I'm going to introduce the next speaker. Give him also 20 minutes to expose his ideas, and then we are going to return to this discussion. So don't forget your arguments, keep them there, safe and alive, and we are going to come back to them. So our next speaker is Kaushik Bhaumik. I'm very pleased to be seeing him just in front of me here, who is Associate Professor in Cinema Studies at the School of Arts and Aesthetics, Nehru University, New Delhi. A film historian specializing in and working on his first monograph on the histories of the emergence of Bombay film industry between 1896 and 1936, Bhaumik has published widely on early cinema, bazaar arts, and modern Indian art and artists. He served as a research fellow at the Ferguson Center for African and Asian Studies, Open University, UK, and as the senior vice president at Ocean's Connoisseurs of Art and the deputy director of the Ocean's Cinefam Festival of Asian and Arab Cinema. Bhaumik guest edited March special issue on 100 years of Bombay cinema, and co-edited Indian cinema book, Visual Sense, A Cultural Reader, and Project Cinema City. Very pleased to be able to include you in the discussion today. So over to you. Looking forward to hearing your views.
Yeah. Thank you, Lucia. It's a pleasure and a privilege to.
Just a minute. Sorry, just a minute for just an interruption. Sorry for making this, but Hazel Orencio has just joined. Hi, Hazel. Is Lav there?
Hi, Parichay. Lav is with me.
Hi.
Yeah.
Oh, great. How are you doing now?
Hey, he's okay. I'm representing him, but he's
great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And Sophia has also joined. She is representing Intellect Books. So sorry about that. Kaushik, please continue.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Sorry. Hi, everybody. Hi, Michael.
Hi, Hazel. It's an amazing moment to be in the same space.
I'm just listening.
I just wanted to beg for some consideration for the time, maybe 3 or 4 minutes above. I'd spoken to Parichay about this. If Lucia is acceptable to the idea, then
Sorry, can you repeat, Kaushik? I missed the question.
I'm just requesting for maybe 3 to 4 minutes or 5 minutes more than the 20 minutes.
That's fine.
Yeah,
the previous
just in case.
Yeah, so let's make it.
Yes.
Nearly.
I shall edit as I go along. But this is a written piece. That's the way I work. So, thanks everyone. Thanks Parichay for inviting me to this very important event. This book response event to the fantastic volume that you and Michael have edited on Lav Diaz, the cinema. So first of all, congratulations to both to you and Michael for getting this book out. And it's just it was a pleasure to read. I mean, I can just reiterate everything that Lucia and Daniel have said before me. So I mean, I shall take that for granted. And what I find, and I'll go on with my first response to the book, and then I shall probably present, sadly, a more academic response to the essays, where, as I read, it will become clear that I'm responding to most of the essays that are there in the volume. So what the monograph does is provides multiple exciting entry points to Diaz's work, but also opens up my imagination to his work anew, which is what I want to speak about later. Um, Needless to say, coming to work afresh through the eyes of other scholars was exhilarating, lighting up Diaz's films as they're discussed in all their thickness in evocative prose, as well as open up other bits of films to the concepts that weave in and out of the pages of this anthology. What really impressed me was that somewhere the essays are all of a piece, and that is exciting for the reader, that conceptual twines weave in and out throughout the book. It makes the process of reading endlessly enchanting and thoughtful, since there's a presence of unity to the whole thing, while there not being a single lid to put on all of what we read. So, needless to say, the arrangement of my thoughts in a particular configuration, which I present, is completely to the credit of the writings presented in Parichay and Michael's wonderful labor of love. And in a very large measure, to the lovely conversations I've been having recently with my dear filmmaker friend Pallavi Paul, currently in Berlin, about catastrophes and breathing. We've been discussing a lot about these things. So for an autobiographical kind of take to get into Love's cinema and the book, my encounter with Lav Diaz started, well, maybe in 2007, when I joined Ocean's Festival for Asian and Arab Cinema. Now, it is one of the pioneering Asian film festivals in the world. It started in the late 90s, actually, coming out of a magazine called Cinemaya, which was probably the first magazine anywhere in the world dedicated solely to Asian cinema. Aruna Vasudev, who founded this festival, was actually a very important figure in the founding of Cinemalaya. She's actually one of the founders of Cinemalaya. And therefore, during the festival, almost everyone from the Filipino scene came in and out of Aruna's office, and we used to say, yeah, Aruna's Filipino boys have, gang has arrived, whenever they would come in. From Alexis Tioseco to Cabandela Cruz, so all the directors, Ore Solito, and, So in 2010, actually, Pete Lacaba, a great author and a very important man of letters of Filipino culture, he got the first Lifetime Achievement Award for writing on cinema, the Aruna Vasudev Lifetime Achievement Award for writing on cinema. Pete Lacaba wrote the fabulous Sister Stella L., Mike DeLeon's Sister Stella L. Now, what was very interesting about my experience with Love during this film festival was that we could never show his films because they would take up the screening time of 3 or 4 films. And, the programmer said, we cannot show these films. They're great films, but we cannot show them. So what I saw of Love, especially, in 2007, I saw Evolution of a Filipino Family and Jeremiah's at just festival screener DVDs. And since then till 2012, I just watched all his later films, which came in as festival screener DVDs, but we couldn't show it. The next thing with Love was when I joined the JNU, and I immediately started a course on Asian cinema, which would always start off with the screening of Ore Solito's Pise, which is a film on this public school called Filipino Science. And it was just as a way of introducing the ethos of Filipino modernity and the space from which Oreas would come out with an ease with his histories and the ecologies and the contemporary society, which was far more inclusive than anything that any film school in India could produce in terms of this mixing of people from all over Philippines in one public school, which had its problems, but it also created a unique atmosphere. This was a utopian thing that I was trying to present to the students and saying, look at this film, the director and the space from which he's coming out. And then Pujita Guha, who is here, she did her MPhil dissertation on Lav Diaz and the Anthropocene, which turned out to be a 400+ page huge affair. Pujita is at present doing her PhD from the University of Santa Barbara. Incidentally, even in my course, I couldn't show my favorite Jeremiah's, and it's my favorite film, and I was really happy to see it being compared to The Idiot, which is my favorite Dostoevsky novel. And for scheduling reasons, I can't show a Lav Diaz film in this course, except for the very contentious Note. So this has been my personal kind of experience, and being with Love, say now for about 13 years. And the scheduling of these long and so-called slow cinema has been a troubling kind of companion through these years in various contexts, in the film festival context, in the pedagogical context. But despite this inability to do Lav Diaz properly as cinema studies pedagogue, Diaz has occupied a lot of my thought and imagination over the years. And here, I would like to very briefly present where I am with Love these days. To begin with, the attempts to connect Diaz with earlier histories of Filipino and third world cinemas is indeed the need of the hour. But we also have to account for the global filmmaker that Lav Diaz is in a certain history of global aesthetics of his time. This might mean taking Adrian Martin's reminder of the fact that Diaz's slow cinema very early on reminded many of us of the empty cinema of Andy Warhol, which is to say, Diaz's cinema is not any old slow cinema, but one very much included in a certain entropic avant-garde art inaugurated by Marcel Duchamp and taking flight with ever more intensity through the works of somebody like Robert Smithson, Warhol, or Brian Eno, the musician, at his 1980s no-wave moment in New York, among others, not to mention the empty durationality of video art, say the works of Namjoon Paik, for example, from Asia. Indeed, for this reason, the emphasis on space in 2 of the chapters in this book was very illuminating for me. Slow is time, but it is also a certain spatiality, a function of duration in the Deleuzian sense, where the idea of duration puts space and time into an indeterminate internal condition of tension and excitation. Here, to take up the idea that William Brown presents, the heliotropic movement image of the nation in bourgeois cinema is suspended in favor of a desert island kind of primordial spatiality from which icons, events, and myths will spring forth, all of a sudden, unannounced from some deep, unseen, and unchartable crystalline complexity of a history of sensation. A terrorist island of a time image springs forth in the no-wave, gaseous video time of cinema. Ghosts are by definition free to move, that being their haunting, precisely because they've been liberated from the shackles of their particular historical time, but attack us with time itself as a shining Vajra dagger, which is coming from Mahayana Buddhism, containing all the intensities of oppression, anger, and pain. So time itself becomes the dagger by which the oppressed fight back, where all seems the endlessness of a Hegelian, Krakauerian end of history. The end of history, note, of course, but the Hegelian idea of the end of history. And Krakauer was one who was as interested in the iconic magical imminence of the mass ornament of the Busby Berkeley type musical as he was a photography as the art of the endlessness of the end of histories in modernity. Space dominates in this endlessness as mist and fog, from which suddenly messianic moments of redemption and historical revenge emerge. But also, as Michael Kho would put it, the ununderstandable magical calculus of the authoritarian state. So this is the space from where the mist and fog from which both emerge in a certain sense. This time of such emergence as redemption gets more and more spread out, and so must Diaz's spatiality, as well as the physical realism of his cinema, as more effort needs to go into the formation of an image in times of entropy, which actually is the flip side of the intensity or the physical realism of state violence, which gets more and more media visceral in the third world, precisely to create the real of its power in knowing that it's over, power is over. The violence gets more and more physically real, precisely because power is gone. Something that Jacques Derrida commented on in the late 1990s in an essay on religion, in a volume that he and Vatimo edited, in the times of evangelical televisuality. Something he described as global Latinization, which must locate his cinema, which must locate Lav Diaz's cinema somewhere on the cusp of Filipino spatial histories and myths of the archipelago itself, onto the edges of the global Anthropocene in the flatness of the Fukuyama end of history boredom, and hence into global histories of art such as land and video art and so on. So the spatiality that Love brings in terms of his history and the history of violence and the extension of this spatiality as the history of violence becomes more and more acute and impossible, is something that kind of pushes the cinema into other histories, which we have to now take into account. And the Anthropocene being a very controversial topic, but yet we must at least take into account what it is all about, the content of the Anthropocene. And I see the Anthropocene more as an aesthetic and ideational logic than as some kind of historical inevitability and so on and so forth, which I think was resolved much earlier. And we don't need to go through with that any longer. More literally, the idea of spatial justice must include the Filipino diaspora, which has been referred to time and again in the book, in global flows of labor and lives, and complicate the idea of this justice beyond the physicality of the Philippines itself. The Filipino history of rap music in the US and video art, for example, and then everything in between. But entropy in Diaz begins with Duchamp himself. What are Diaz's artless images but examples of the Duchamp ready-made, which defines itself as an artless object that becomes art precisely because the artist's inattention alighted on it? Indeed, Diaz's cinema veers from such empty, ready-made, artless moments towards a momentum of iconic revelation all the time. You begin with this ready-made, empty space, and then things move towards an iconic revelatory moment. Jeremias, again, is a case in point where, really it's full of ready-mades, and that's probably why I like it so much. Indeed, artless ready-mades, but what of Duchamp's inattention? Not just any other inattention, distraction, doing a found object exercises, lightning shock of the surrealist gaze at the world. The ordinary urinal, the fountain, his famous piece of 1913, is weaponized at that very moment to emerge as a revolutionary tool, the moment Duchamp looks at it and says that this is art. Diaz too sets his territories free like empty time filled with artless ready-made cows and so on, and then zeroes in on attractor points of iconic imminence for these ready-mades guided by a sensory memory of the lands he shoots in. So for me, Diaz is like this: I know this land, but I'm now going to empty myself of memory, go into it as if it's an empty space, into this entropic space, and then see how it all comes through, the present and his past and the histories that he has been researching, then come together to recreate a certain kind of, but this emptying of Diaz into this entropic negative space is very important to begin with. He has to do that to start off his cinema. History for Diaz is a dialectic between the dark entropic tensionless string, emptied of time and history, and the actual draftsman's wooden tools made to the outline of the shape the strings took when Duchamp dropped them on a canvas for his magnificent 3 standard stoppages. So what Duchamp did was he just 1 meter of 3 strings. He just let them drop on the canvas. Then he just took the outline and made out wooden draftsman's tools out of them to that shape. And so the artwork consists of these wooden tools in a coffin-like thing, and then in 3 kind of vitrines, the 3 strings are kind of fitted in that vitrine. Of course, the point would be to notice the difference between how a tool does in heliotropic bourgeois histories of the nation and what it does in the dark entropic histories of those who suffer ecological and political violence as a condition of their lives enforced by this heliotropism. The difference would be something between the arts of war of the imperial forces and Shaolin monks around the same weapon. Things are especially noisy and white light here, dark and secretive, underground, again, Dostoevskian theme, just as the no-wave movement produces the cellar noise music of the Sonic Youth, a band Diaz must have known in his youth. Happenings, famous happenings of the American minimalists, some kind of Samuel Beckettian garbage entropy theater in the boredom of hyper-capitalist times, in basement darkness away from public stardom, much as in Diaz's cinema. So this always withdrawing from a public stardom, going into it, it's a complex relationship of ethics for the current cultural stars who want to be ethical. Things go secret, go darker, and then suddenly emerge as lightning, possession by history, a just people's response to the heliotropic cinema that Asia was cursed with, the A-bomb that ended World War II, and to which much of East and Southeast Asia's destiny goes back one way or another. There is another kind of waiting room of history here, that of the basement world, that of Patricia Highsmith's Storm Ripley, where the entire history of Western post-World War II aesthetics unravels in the underground movements of a Dostoevskian criminal figure, that's Ripley. All that zing of, the modernist art happening from under the soil through what Ripley does. A secret, the fast cars, all of that is happening, what Ripley is doing under the soil as a hidden kind of criminal agent of history. A secret rhizome informing great art. Ripley only waits for moments of history, that he instigates but never participates in. A monstrous Deleuzian child born out of European aesthetics, buggered from behind by Highsmith, probably lover of Tom's mother. Dark entropy and light heliotropism brings me to Norte. If Kazimir Malevich's Black Square sets the history of modernity in the reverse perspective of iconic paintings sent to quantum physics in the model of a black hole, the black square against the white outline, the painting breathes with the white disappearing into the black and then reemerges as an event horizon, kind of light that comes out at the edge of a black hole. Then the painting is also all about what is not shown. It's obviously about color, between the presence of all colors and the total absence, and the total absence. In short, about Norte, which emerges precisely in color because it is about the big heliotropic history of Marcos. It is between the black and white. It is history as we live it, which is a colored history, but it is framed by the black and white of the Malevich black and white, where the color is only in between this, breathing of black and white into each other in a certain kind of universe, entropic history. There's a digital photoshopping joy with which Diaz shows the bow and pop colors encasing the Marcos figure on a boat disappear into the white light, and therefore into the darkness behind that light, into the darkness, leaving behind the space for the black and white entropic cinema of Diaz's. Color, I feel, serves in Diaz's film as a very particular entropic moment in his historical meditations, a measure of a scale of history that ironically makes shorter color films about heliotropic histories. In short, we must see Diaz's cinema as breathing between black and white, cycles of darkness, dark because too full of forms and lives waiting to burst through the envelope of time, and light when form appears only to die, with color forming a point of chiasmus between the two polarities of his color cinema. So color, but all of Diaz's cinema is color cinema in that sense. Most of the time, we get a kind of Joy Division synthesize a gray tone, some kind of gray drone music of the 1970s avant-garde as a color of Diaz's cinema, memorably veering more often than not towards the black. This is since black is what the universe comes from and black is what it disappears into. Form is gray as energy takes form only to die, a weak light. Only the moment of birth as a revolutionary spark, the moment of Duchamp's distracted gaze on the urinal, which does look like a uterus, when the body takes in all its breath possible and exhales itself into terminal extinction, the thing we call life. So this life, what we call, is just a terminal extinction of an energy form which we have never lived. The energy's life is getting over, and that's when form happens. The gray neutral urinal all the way. Life is just this gray neutral urinal all the way, bereft of the shock magic of the artist's gaze, and yet carrying a representational importance and value. The tool at the end is framed by the lifeless string, getting emptied of time, irrespective of our uses of it, whether revolutionary or authoritarian. Cinema or authoritarianism, revolution, that is a shadowy double of reliving the revolution of birth as secondary shadows of that moment in the form of miracles and iconic emergences, which is representation. The iconic emergences of the brain as a terrible deity. The sense of being alive in the full scientific knowledge of terminal extinction. The urinal as a photographic weak image double of the flash of Duchamp's light gaze. It would be hard to avoid a post-second law of thermodynamics, avant-garde wisdom of a Robert Smithson kind of the inevitability of unilateral entropy in Diaz's cinema, wherein sequence after sequence, landscape is evacuated of time and history to such degree zero. There's something that runs between the iconic thought of a Russian Malevich and the Spanish Baroque of Diaz's Filipino Christian grace, the idea of life as a breathing entity, where opposites are constantly crossing over in the reversibility of time. There's this lovely article where this crossing over between these two figures, one who is utterly damned, but always saved from before, the Dostoevskian theme, and the one who is looking, the salvific, which never actually is saved. But what is crossing over is also black and white, darkness and light, but also the strange costuming of Diaz's avant theatrics, this kind of garbage theater aesthetics that he uses, these avant theatrics that regress in history as well as move forward. Actually, that's the third world thing. We never know whether anything is moving forward or backward, because it's the modernity, the catastrophe modernity of industrial capitalism in the third world does produce that parallax in a certain sense of not knowing which way time is going. The dark underground cellar, which is again, as a space of both statist torture and possessed trance noise performance of immanence. Christianity as exploitation and salvation, nature as bountiful and destructive, Marcos as or as not revolution. But other things cross over as well. Most notably, I think, the gift of space and simple movement to the risk society of the West, where space is constantly being folded back into security-crazy mobility in a perpetual paranoia of fiscal bankruptcy. I think a lot of the joy of Lav Diaz's cinema in the West is just to see the simple logic of space and the small movement, where movement is so problematic. A gift to such numbed, bored senses, and in the reverse, the gift of certain avant-garde history of art that informed Diaz's moment, not consciously maybe, but because of the ways in which the scene he belongs to is informed by such histories. But the overall sense of doom gone beyond return in Diaz's masterpieces might indicate that entropy is winning irreversibly. People are opting out of history as a form of redemption. Joaquin becomes a shaman and the woman leaves. Lines of flight, mysticism, gendered solitude, diaspora. As totalitarian drives the literal ground of the Philippines down into irreversible ecological entropy, people just up and leave that ground of history. So what of post-colonial history and a progressive politics of historical redemption in all this? The first would be to accept the full extent of globalization and reimagine nations as spread across the world, landscapes and histories interpenetrating each other in complex ways. In this, the history of modernism shifts very emphatically in its intensities to where there are still those histories in action that frame modernity, which is the third one. Diaz is the truth of Duchamp's revolutionary call to give up retinal art and go grey and entropy. In short, go artless. So it is, if we talk about Duchamp, we should love Diaz, not talk about other people. The caterpillar land movers bearing civilization into archaeological stratigraphy that marks Smithson's land art are more intense in the third one, and so on. Pedagogy must respond to this shift by saying land art history is really about filmmakers like Diaz. That surrealism finds its most intense realization in the cinema of Apichat Pongvira Satakul. Nothing short of claiming the entire ground of history for the third world as a medium of all histories. And in this move, changing histories and the theories towards more complexity and nuance. And if I have been endlessly emphasizing genealogies of Diaz's cinema in moments of Western art history, and Malevich is of course the exception because that's why I took up Malevich, then it is only to point out that post-colonial histories too must enter a new phase of discourse, that of science, quantum physics, post-Hiroshima, to put the sign of all our histories of everybody under the sign of Hiroshima, to claim entropic art in the name of Hiroshima. That is the real catastrophe of our histories that has gone completely unacknowledged, the bomb being stolen in discourse by Western Cold War. And yet the great art that comes out is all under the sign of Hiroshima. How can we understand land art without a reference to Hiroshima? We can't. We can't understand any of this without references to certain things which have been absolutely, and I don't think Hiroshima has been acknowledged at all. Not to do away with 19th century models of post-colonial histories, but to see how they do in times of quantum computation, where Virilio says we are traveling faster than the speed of light. But the digital makes quantum science demotic. And because it is with the digital that science becomes demotic, not technology, but science, unconsciously, and therefore to make this fact conscious, this fact of science becoming demotic, that it makes our lives, all of this must be acknowledged now. Digitality takes flight from the surface of Duchamp's chessboard, a model of the Puranic story of the Indic Ocean, churned, emanating all the treasures and ills of the universe, leading to the black of the demons and the whites of the gods, fighting interminably over the possession of the nectar of immortality. This Duchamp's chessboard rests in the time of God playing quantum dice, and it moves on to the endless land on paper, spit out by the Xerox machine, intersecting with Smithson's spiral jetty in Cold War nuclear freeze. The jetty being a found object in spatial infinity through which the universe will extinguish itself. Just as every digital image is a ready-made found object in the game of chance of infinite variability on which computation is based, images through which energy is dissolving towards terminal entropy at unbelievable speed, but also inventing ways of preserving life beyond Earth, maybe even post-universe. That is what quantum computation is doing. We are trying to figure out ways of going to Mars, how to be, cyber frozen and so on and so forth. That is really what quantum computation is all about. Things can only get worse for the third world in this Western chase of chancing upon cyber immortality through algorithmic uncertainty. All the boom and bust debris of failed experiments will be piled upon the non-West. So things will get worse on this side of things. Here, are we not describing the length of Diaz's films? To let land roll on until the object is found, the image forms in the correct ecological intensity in infinity, formed by the oceanic winds that swirl over Philippines, creating its light and dark, and therefore Diaz's cinema, where history returns as a ghost. The world would gain from this nuclear history of the non-West the way to accept the end of the universe as an inevitable telos and go on with life as a Japanese usual. A lesson from that great ready-made of history, the mushroom at the end of the universe, a very real vision of the end of the universe, a bonsai model of the end of everything, the urinal smashed on our heads. What discourses after such a thing? What cinema can catch this magnificent image to riff on Godard's lament for cinema having failed to respond to Second World War? That he should say such a thing is a sign of a very finite European imagination, manageable at human scales of response, because he doesn't say anything about Hiroshima. In the realm of Dostoevskian idealism, all we can say is that the only comfort we have is that all our deaths are part of the universe dying a greater death than ours, when no one is a winner. What remains to be done is to return to some kind of mythic, absurdist, avant-garde shadow puppet pantomime of the Manichaean exploitation and justice, where the only stakes might be to disabuse dictators of the illusions of immortality that underlie their drive to hoard at the expense of others, and allow a modicum of well-being for all destined for the same end. So the impossibility of immortality has to be pointed out again and again, for which all the troubles are, at the end of the day, in a certain kind of politics, in a certain kind of dictatorial ambition. And we know how the illusion of immortality drives these dictators. To say endlessly that torture and death will never constitute the real of their illusions. Of course, the shadow puppeteer is a locus of social wisdom precisely because he or she knows that the black and white are merely convenient pivot points to start with, from which all will unravel and all will dissolve into nothing. For things to begin again, that's mythic time, cyclical time. Only this time we know that things will end for sure. Therefore, how to teach the end of the universe beyond the comforting, model mathematical virtuality of science is historic fact, which there's a huge difference between knowing that the universe will end as a mathematical model and actually making it a part of pedagogy to start schooling with. That, to therefore defy all the myths of achievement, the little hint of immortality that is thrown into everything that we do, all the goals and ambitions that we are told to follow. We might here begin with, in this pedagogy, we might begin with Lav Diaz here, in whom floats the cinema of an Ozu, an Ichikawa, a Mizoguchi, a Kobayashi, and many more. Maybe a global history where European history dies at Zabriskie Point, California, Antonioni's cinema, where there can be no physical realism to globally floating bodies. While this history dies, the shockwaves of European revolutions travel eastwards to culminate in the capitalist summit of China, the two crossing over in Japan. The land of the Burmese harp, early spring, and Sancho Dayu, a film that always comes to mind when I'm watching Diaz's films. And the greatest horror and monster cinema of world history, all speaking about Hiroshima in their own impossible ways. And all else, all the other post-colonial third world history is informed by the echoes of this. I'm not saying that, this must be the thing. The echoes need to get into science, into the post-Hiroshima mode of entropy and so on and so forth. The line between art and Diaz's cinema, which needs to be a certain new framework to think through whatever we are doing. Lav Diaz's cinema poses a challenge to. And so therefore, all else that is informed by these echoes of this art, especially Lav Diaz. So I'll end here. And yeah.
Thank you very much. That was quite spectacular. A world of references here. We have really gone around the globe with this talk, which has triggered so many questions in my mind. And perhaps the central one refers to the question of modernity, which I think is really crucial. The post Second World War modernity, as defined by Deleuze and by Bazin before Deleuze, of course, as the kind of cinema that elicits this empty time, but then throwing us back to a modernity as modernism, the pre-World War modernism, and Duchamp, and the presence of this ready-made and the empty time that was already there. So perhaps the Second World War will just open up entirely for this kind of approach that was already there in the history of art. And I really love that phrase that you brought in also the question of space. That was also very important for Deleuze and his scheme based on durée, the duration, and Bergson's conception of time. But I love that thing about the empty space that moves on to revelatory moments, and you quoted Harry Myers here as a privileged example of that. My question
only for me, my particular, I mean, the whole of Lav Diaz is.
I know. Kaushik, there is so much in your paper that I would like to discuss, and that ended with a plethora of Japanese classical filmmakers who I also absolutely love, but went around the whole question of post-colonialism, globalization, the digital speed, and so much more. But this question of modernism is one that in a way excites and bothers me at the same time, because it's a history that was created for the European kind of thought and the kind of art produced in Europe, very often stolen from other countries such as Africa and so on, and turned into modernity when elsewhere they were not considered modern, they were considered folklore or whatever else. And it's a model that is very evolutionist in conception, so moving from classical to modern, and then postmodern, and then post-post. And which I always find slightly flawed when universally applied. And so that's my question, what the benefits are in going back to this kind of model, to Duchamp, who is obviously a model for us to think about what is defined as art.
Yes, I think
to this kind of framework. So I would like to ask you about this particular applicability, universal applicability of a model which was developed essentially in Europe and served European interests.
Yes. No, I mean, I think I was trying to hint at that because I'm very aware of this problem, but by saying that modernity is a disaster for the third world, but, Duchamp is seeing modernity as a disaster, and Smithson are seeing modernity as a disaster, but they are seeing it as an art moment. For us, that is history. Land art is history. It's being done. That difference. The catastrophe as a model out there, and the reality of the bomb. You can model the end of the universe and make an A-bomb and drop it on Hiroshima. That difference between the model of modernity and the working out of modernity, that tension needs to be brought out, rather than throw the modernity out, but create a tension between how there's a model out there and how it's absolutely catastrophic to the point where it becomes a reality of that model, and therefore that's what I'm saying, to appropriate, to say that if you're teaching Duchamp, it has to be taught through Lav Diaz, I mean, and to say that this is what that history is, not using it as a genealogy of derivation, but as a historical process by which, ironically, the third world turns out to be the greatest laboratory of the greatest artistic ideas, the ready-made and so on and so forth. That would be my way of approaching this problem, and appropriating all the terms of history away from European history and saying, but we are living that history, through a lived history of those concepts. And yours is a model, but this is land art in the making. This is not Smithson doing some experiment out there, but we are doing it in a certain sense, or Duchampian entropy and so on and so forth. Because the world which has suffered Hiroshima doesn't need to learn about entropy from Smithson or anybody else. But there is a genealogy of Western thinking. And so to make these two entropy models talk, one as a model and one as a reality, both are convinced that capitalism is a disaster and so on and so forth. But to open up this gap to a dialogue, between the lived reality and the modular kind of Western logical modernity. That would how I would start off an initial conversation on this subject.
Yeah, great. I believe that our audience is looking forward to offering their views and opinions and questions. I wonder, Parichay, whether we should invite audiences to speak or to drop their questions on the chat. How would you like to organize this?
They can speak directly if they want.
Okay, so we are now taking questions for the audience. Let's see how we can do that. Is there a hand that you can raise in this Google
Yeah,
program? Yeah.
they can raise a hand.
Yeah, people can raise their hands. If I don't see any hands, I'll proceed with my own questions while I wait for you to come forward and offer your questions. So perhaps I should give a chance for Daniel to go back to some of the questions we were discussing, and I think I cut his word short before he completed his thoughts. But if I could throw another issue into the mix that connects to the idea of authorship and the almighty figure of the auteur, is the opposite side of it, which is the fanboyism that is so stressed out and stressed up in the book and criticized and discussed. So how does one depend on the other, and how could we move on from this kind of conundrum that you so well described in your talk?
That's a big question. I'm not sure I have a necessarily a solution. I mean, what I think it's interesting, you in your last question, you brought up this kind of the fact that the auteur is often coded as a male auteur. Seems to have this a kind of very masculinist quality to a lot of prevailing conceptions of auteur cinema, but also just the figure of the author, let's say, more generally. And then its kind of pendant is precisely, I mean, it's not like a coincidence that it's called the fanboy, and that there is this kind of I mean, patriarchal relationship, possibly an Oedipal relationship. I'm not sure how much we want to go down that path, but certainly that's also very male coded as a mode of film viewing, or a film kind of culture, let's say, which seems to be wrapped up a lot with where I think where I think reception of Lav Diaz can kind of go down the wrong path is just this idea of his films as being these kind of like challenges for spectatorial endurance that you have to kind of rise to the challenge for, and that proves A, that he's a great, filmmaker and therefore the great male genius, and that you are the great spectator who is able to watch these films and not just get to the end, but like it and be like, revel in it and boast about it. You've watched the whole 7 hours of the Lav Diaz film. I think what's interesting, I mean, the conundrum I find, this is going off in a slightly different track, but I think that's something we have to get away from, obviously, as in terms of film culture. But I think this film is a good tonic to that. This book is a good tonic to that, and I think possibly there has been a kind of let's say, a reaction to that. I think it's the question of duration as kind of this endurance feat, or like this kind of, you know, achievement of stamina and so on and so forth, is an interesting one, because it's a question I come up also with or against, certainly in teaching cinema and teaching kind of like, you know, long form cinema in particular, which is, you know, you propose with your students to watch you know, a 4 or 5 hour film, whether it's Lav Diaz or whether it's you know, another filmmaker, and they kind of recoil in horror at the very thought of it. And then my thought is always, well, what did you do on the weekend? You probably watched, like, you know, at least 4 or 5 hours of some Netflix series, without giving it a second thought, without thinking that that was like some, like, you know, immense like challenge. And why is it that the Lav Diaz film is kind of freighted with that with that kind of apprehension, whereas the Netflix series is not? It's just something you do out of pleasure, out of just like, you know, you have lots of time on your hands, so you do it. You just watch one episode after another after another after another. You don't even think that that's what you've done. I think though that there is still something there. I think Lav Diaz. It was interesting that Kaushik was saying, like, you know, you watched a lot of his films on screeners. I guess I've had the fortune to mainly watch his films in cinemas, or at least in cinema-like viewing conditions. Classroom, for instance, where you can do a screening. And I would probably have a lot more difficulty in actually watching it as a screener or on a streaming service or whatever, because somehow I actually need the cinematic environment in order to, like, in order to have that, I think the fortitude almost to do it, or the will. And I think there is also a case where, let's say, where was I going with this thought? You know, I think his films do resist a spectator, let's say, more than the Netflix series, let's say. And that's something we should work with. And maybe this concept of a kind of a tension or a resistance between filmmaker and spectator is the kind of productive outlet that we can move away from this. Either you have this, the dopamine like plugged into your system of like the Netflix series, or you have this kind of you know, kind of endurance competition of spectators, or like, you know, who are kind of all adulating the great auteur. Instead, it's kind of more like, I think it works. I think the best way to approach Lav Diaz's films is more as a way of kind of entering into a dialogue with the filmmaker, and one in which there's going to be moments of, I think Kaushik has mentioned this, others in the book mentioned this, moments of profound revelation and profound kind of almost ecstasy or whatever in his films, but also moments where you're battling with the film, and you should admit that, you know, you should admit that that's part of and I think Lav Diaz recognizes that that's part of the viewing experience of a Lav Diaz film. There's a moment where you're like, how much more can I go with this? Do I need to break? Do I need to leave? Do I need to come back? Whatever. Those are all part, I think, and inseparable from the fact of viewing a Lav Diaz film. I think, Michael, with your text where you talk about the kind of his demands about screenings, it was very informative for me in that sense.
I would have a question. Thanks very much, Daniel. That's incredibly.
I just had a question for both Daniel and Lucia. Talking about the gender thing, would you know, the lighter cameras, starting with the video times, have made any difference to women shooting longer films, and the difference of labor in terms of this masculine thing of the big cameras, and as the equipment gets smaller? Does the equation change? And Lav Diaz belongs to a world where the equipment has got smaller. And do the gender equations change with that? Even the theories of auteurism might change with that.
Would Daniel like to answer this?
Well, I would like that to be the case. I'm not sure if it is so much, though. It seems to me that, I mean, one of the big unspoken elements of slow cinema is that the major figures are almost all met. There are a few exceptions. I mean, maybe Lucretia Martel. I don't know, Lucia, if you know of others.
Of course, yeah.
But it still seems to be a very male-dominated framework, and
Yeah.
that's maybe something worth interrogating. I mean, it's
Yeah.
definitely something worth
At
interrogating.
the moment, perhaps other people will join. But the interesting thing I find about female filmmakers, and now I'm approaching this subject from a Brazilian point of view, where I have studied a bit more the female participation in filmmaking, is the tendency towards shared authorship, and how much women have worked with male friends, with male colleagues, with male partners, husbands, colleagues. This is so prevalent. And very often, if you look at males who became very famous, there is a female figure that is hidden or not mentioned. For example, City of God in Brazil was co-directed by a woman. She's hardly ever mentioned. A film like The Act of Killing, which became a kind of a defining moment in documentary filmmaking, hardly anyone mentions Christine Sine, who is the co-director of that film. There is a kind of eloquence on the part of Joshua Oppenheimer that meant that everybody rushed to him, and also perhaps also the fact that he's a man with more authority, or apparently having more of the authority and authorial input into the film. So this happens so often. And so, in fact, if you look closely, you will find that there is much more female filmmaking in the world than we are ready to admit. And that is very much the case of Brazil from, in particular, the moment of the so-called revival of Brazilian cinema in the mid-1990s, where there was an explosion of female filmmakers, many of whom were former actresses and who had never been given the opportunity of directing a film and then became directors in their own right. But I feel that they tend to call in people to contribute, to share their work more often, and also share the credits. So perhaps the problem is not so much on the length, but on where exactly the female figure is within that team of film making and decision making about the film. If I could turn the question back to you, Kaushik, because I was so fascinated by your comments on color, black and white, and the use of color in Lav Diaz films. And if I understood correctly, you did say that black and white was somehow embedded in the use of color and the other way around, and it's always color, even when it's black and white.
Yes. What I was trying to say is that Love is working with that kind of a framework where black, white, color are all the time happening, in a certain sense, So it's an experimentation with the absence of light and absence of color and the total presence of color, and then color itself, So which would make his films a meditation on color in some senses, its absence or total presence, when it disappears into white light, and so on and so forth. So to actually look at it as more of an experimentation with the spectrum of absence, presence, and and so on and so forth of color, or all colors and no colors and then colors. And my thing was that Norte is made in color because it is about that heliotropic history, and it has a particular subject. When he's working with the subaltern histories, he will not use color. But when it comes to Marcos, there's a need to use color in a certain sense. And which is also in the color theory, life or history as a color version of a larger play on black and white that's going on in the universe, as light itself. And how this play of black and white then informs religiosity, and then, the conscious, the Manichaean theories of good and evil, and so on and so forth. So there's a cascade of metaphors which work from the purely natural or the quantum physics part of black and white to religious theories, oppositions of values, and then history as being this color version of things, but ephemeral. I mean, that's why Marcos disappears. It's a beautiful scene where he just goes poof, and you're shocked. He doesn't get returned, he just goes away. You're thinking, well, something should happen to this guy. And it's quite a happy ending for him. It seems to be very ecstatic in going off in this boat through that fantastic, surreal waterways, that landscape. And then he just disappears in white light, I mean, so that's why I'm saying that there was a certain kind of pop Photoshop kind of manipulation of coloring in that sequence, which really got me. I mean, it really caught my attention at that point in time.
Yeah, so, if I could add something, I don't know, Parichay, how much more time we have. Do we have another 5 minutes for a last
question? Surely. And I also want to add something to that filmmaking and gender question as it came up. So, of course, I agree with Daniel that almost all the filmmakers belonging to the proverbial slow cinema camp, even though I strongly doubt the existence of such a camp, but all of them are male, invariably. Even the films that sparked some kind of a controversy or debate, those films are also made by male filmmakers. I think, Daniel, you mentioned that article on Honey, the Turkish film, that is by Semi Kaplanoglu. Kaplanoglu. And in the context of Latin American cinema, Lucia, since you mentioned that, I think all over that continent, of course, experimental cinema has a very different history. So in case of Argentine experimental cinema, one of the pioneering figures is Marie-Louise Aleman, but not in the more mainstream industrial production system. I mean, if we think of women filmmakers from the continent, as you are talking about the Brazilian context, we can think of Lucrecia Martel, whom Daniel has just mentioned, and Maria Luisa Bembark, both from Argentina, and perhaps more recently someone like Mariana Rondon from Venezuela, but not such a towering figure. Like, as I said, Marie-Louise Aleman in the context of experimental cinema. Right, so I agree with that. And of course, in again, slow cinema camp, Chelan, almost throughout Chelan's career, Chelan's partner, Ebru Chelan, collaborated with him, worked with him. Nobody talks about Ebru Chelan.
Yes. I just wanted to add to this question, which combines with the thing about color that I find so fascinating, the way that you are including the manipulation of the color patterns in the film as an interesting feature, which brings about the degree of reflexivity that is embedded in the approach in the films Lav Diaz, and not just reflexivity, but the self-reflexivity, the realism of the medium, how the thanks to the duration, the long duration, we are forced to think about how this film is being made, how the camera is moving, how the color has been manipulated, because we have that time to think about it and to pay attention to how this is a cinematic product and not reality itself. So there is also, I think, an ethical question, attitude of revealing the process of filmmaking within the film, and a different kind of realism, which is the Brechtian realism, which brings your consciousness to an awareness to the fact that this is a film. So I think the thing about the extended length and all these technical aspects that we become very aware of during the lengthy period of watching the film, in particular those where we feel bothered with the length of the film, the one who brings this reflexive process to the spectator. So that's something I wanted to add about this.
No, I mean, that's the point that I was trying to make, that he's not using black and white in the same Manichaean symbolic ways as Bergman is. I think there's something more going on there. There's something about light itself as a natural phenomenon, and the properties of light that's going on there, which is why I was trying to say that science must enter this picture somewhere, something which cannot be explained entirely through, there's some other consciousness of something that informs the way science informs at the Anthropocene that is there. It's controversial, but you need to take into account a certain way in which only Diaz's cinema kind of pushes it in that direction more than any other person. Bellatar also, I feel, does it, but not as radically as Diaz does through his complete, because Bellatar's images are composed. There is no emptiness of intention. Bellatar would never make a film like Evolution of a Filipino Family or a film like that. You know, the images are very composed.
Incidentally, one of our contributors is a known Bellatar scholar, and Marco Grasoli. Marco published the first Italian monograph on Bellatar.
Yes. So that's what differentiates, Diaz, his complete, ability to let things drift into something which is more than what can be accounted for in film theory or symbolic logics of criticism, which fascinates me. I mean, this is just a proposal, I think.
Sophia, would you like to say something on behalf of the publisher?
I just wanted to say that it was really interesting hearing all the discussions and the two talks in general about how the critical view of the book has been taken. It was quite nice that Lav Diaz also got to have a little sneak in here about the discussion around the book as well and his thoughts. And just on the behalf of Intellect, this is what we would like to do with the books we publish. We wanted to engage critics in the field and academics to see what their thoughts are. So it's just been really a pleasure to be here. So thanks for inviting me.
Lucia, thanks, Sophia, for that. And Intellect Books helped us in whatever way possible. They publicized this event through their Instagram handle, if I'm not mistaken. So thanks for that, Sophia. Lucia, please take over as the moderator. Then I can deliver a vote of thanks once you are done.
Yes. I was really impressed with the fascinating papers produced by the two speakers. I learned huge amounts, and I will spare some more time to go back and watch the Diaz films that I haven't watched yet. I think that the book has been a great achievement. And in terms of not wanting to compete with Intellect, but I run a series called World Cinema Series with Bloomsbury. If you want an alternative publishing house or series to offer your projects, please remember my series, World Cinema. It's open. It runs on an open call for book proposals. So remember to send that to me. As well as to Sophia. And I think on that note, I should let our very patient audience go. And thanks again to Parichay. I'm sad that Michael Lim didn't have the chance to say anything. I don't know if he would like to say something as the co-editor of the book.
Yeah, no, it's really just thanking all of you for sharing your thoughts on our book. I organized the Philippine launch, and Parichay is organizing more of this book discussion. So that's I think how we divided our task for this. And apparently, I just joined University of Glasgow, and it's been very, very hectic for me. So yeah, but otherwise, it's really been wonderful hearing your thoughts about our book. And so thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Lucia. So it's time to wrap
Congratulations again to both of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So let me deliver the formal vote of thanks. So I'd like to thank my department for hosting this as a part of the seminar series here in IIT Jodhpur. I'd like to thank my co-editor, Michael Kho Lim. Despite his extremely busy schedule, he has recently joined Glasgow, but he has been able to join. I'd like to thank Sophia and Intellect Books for publicizing the event and for all other help. Hazel Orencio and Lav is quite sick. He has hurt himself in his shooting, and with a swollen leg, he is bedridden now in some place in the Philippines where they don't have a good stable internet connection. Despite all such odds, they joined for some time. So now Hazel has left, but I'd like to thank Hazel and Lav for joining. Now, of course, I'd like to thank Lucia for taking the role of the moderator, and we had discussion over several emails on how the event should go. And I'm really thankful to Lucia for her role as moderator. The way it unfolded, it's beyond what I expected or assumed. Thanks, Daniel. So again, braving all odds and odd hours in the US Eastern Standard Time. You're here, and you I hope you had some sleep. So thanks very much for this. So originally Daniel was supposed to contribute to the book, but because of his busy schedule, he couldn't. So I'm still sorry for that loss, but somehow, it has been compensated by Daniel's verbal contribution in the discussion event. Thanks very much, Kaushik, for being here, despite being on sabbatical. And I'd like to thank our doctoral candidates and master's candidates like Tushar and Sanjay. They helped me with the event, they designed the poster that was circulated. And I'd like to thank the audience. They joined from various institutions all over the globe. So thank you so much. That's the end of it. I have recorded the entire session and I'll post it on YouTube channel. And the link will be posted on social media. The link will be mailed to all the speakers and the moderator. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Parichay.
Thank you,
Thank
Daniel.
you. Thank you. Thanks.